Good morning. And thank you, Arthur and Art, for inviting me, and also thanks very much for the audience for listening to this conversation about, I'm calling it dosage, so I'm not so sure that I'm going to actually say everything that Arthur said I was going to say, but I'm going to do my best to talk to you today about dosage. And I think that Arthur asked me to give this presentation because about 2 years ago, colleagues and I wrote a brief for OPRE, the Office of Policy, Research and Evaluation, on dosage and early childhood interventions and how that fit into the implementation of science work that's been going on in early childhood. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you a little bit about what we learned about from dosage from that paper, but also what we know about preschool and dosage, and talk to you a little bit about perhaps looking at dosage may not be necessarily the only thing that we should be looking at when we're talking about early childhood and early childhood interventions. And so I also would like to just say one disclaimer. Many of the programs that I'm going to talk about today have been developed by many of you in the audience. We went back and looked at original documents, or thought we were looking at original documents. If there's errors, please see me afterwards and I will correct them. Thank you. Preschool dosage. What do we know about this? Well, first I'm going to provide you with some definitions of dosage. Sorry. And then I'm going to hopefully be able to give you a review of the research. And in that review of research, I'm going to address mostly issues that are concerned about amount of preschool. How much preschool may be needed in order to be able to get achieved outcomes. An amount is obviously associated with the economics of preschool. So the more preschool you perhaps may need to achieve outcomes is obviously going to cost more. But I'd like to be able to suggest to you as we go through this talk today that you really cannot talk about dosage separate from content and quality of program. And you also then need to address the issue of outcome. What outcomes are you trying to achieve? So dosage and content are uniquely integrated and tied to one another, as well as quality. So when you talk about preschool dosage, I would suggest that we need to talk about these other variables as well. So I'll begin with some definitions, go through what we know about the research on dosage and preschool, but then talk to you a little bit about how content and quality and affect dosage and child outcomes. These are a lot of definitions, so just bear with me, but I will explain them a little bit better in the other slides. And I will explain the asterisk on the frequency and intensity when I get to the end of the slide. When we talk about frequency, we're mostly talking about how often the intervention is delivered. So, for example, home visiting, for example. Are you visiting twice a week for 1.5 hours, or 3 times a week for an hour? Preschool, are you having class sessions 2 hours long, 3 hours long, 5 hours long? The frequency is considered in the dosage literature, as well as the intensity. What is the strength of an intervention, or how much of a particular component of intervention is delivered in each session? So, for example, if the intervention is focused on social emotional development, how much of the child's day actually is being taken up by that intervention specifically? What is the intensity? And that's how intensity in dosage is usually considered. Intervention duration, this is one I think we're probably more familiar with in terms of the length of the full intervention. How long did the intervention go for? Typically, when we talk about preschool, we talk about either 9 months or a year. We often talk about 2 years, the length of the duration of the intervention. Session duration is typically associated with the length of full day, and as many of you know, much has been looked at in terms of does it matter, half day or full day in terms of pre-K, so how long the session is. Cumulative dosage, on the other hand, refers to how much of the intervention over time or the life of the program that the actual the people that went to it are getting. Sorry. And then finally, threshold dosage, a specific dosage level at which an intervention affects outcome. Basically, how much do you need to get the outcomes that you're looking for? How much do you need for the results? And so I put asterisks by frequency and intensity because as we reviewed the literature, it became quite obvious that these were 2 areas in which early childhood and preschool did not really look at. We do not really have good studies that look at this specifically in terms of what we know about. Now, they may about particular programs, but not necessarily in terms of how much you need in terms of intensity and frequency. So I think that's interesting, especially if we're going to talk about content and also quality. Why aren't these things actually looked at more closely? So The other thing we also noticed was that there was an incredible attention in these programs to talking about high quality. People use that term quite freely, at least in the work that we reviewed, and I think that it would be an important point for us to consider what we actually mean when we say high quality and what components are important to be included to be even maybe determined a high quality program. But in the terms of the programs that we reviewed, many of them consider themselves high quality, which they could have been, but lack definition about what actually was meant by high quality. So let's review the literature of what we know in terms of dosage and preschool. Session duration. We actually do know, and thanks to, again, Arthur's work, full day and half a day, greater effects on cognitive and social emotional outcomes. In general, being in class matters more full day than half day. And this research is similar to what we know in terms of kindergarten work. The similar data was found with kindergarten. However, there's a big qualifier, but quality matters. And I'm sure anyone in the room would not obviously think that that is an interesting point. We also know that, for example, even if you have full day, you get less, and the quality is not great, the effects are less. So it makes us think that perhaps it's not just dose, but also what's in the dose, and also trying to figure out what is the quality actually that makes a high quality program. So, but again, we do know a bit about session duration, and that being in class in high quality programs does matter more than being in less in preschool classrooms. So what do we know about duration? Does it less than a year matter more than 2 versus 3 years? And again, with a review of the research that was available, the following data was gleaned. Outcomes are better for children who attend preschool versus children who don't. In many of the studies that were done, the comparison group was students that did not attend preschool, so non-attendees. And in fact, preschool turns out to be better than not going to preschool, that's the good news. Also, probably not surprising, outcomes are better for children in 1 to 3 year programs versus less than a year. So attending preschool more than a full year and then beyond is also better than being in for less than a year. And this is work from Steve Barnett's work. And again, not necessarily very good stuff on being able to know 1 versus 2. Threshold and duration. I think this is probably, to me, a very interesting finding, and again, based on the work of folks in the room. The incremental effects of attending a first year of preschool is generally greater magnitude than that of a second year. So you don't get the full bang of a second year as you did in the first year. That's not to say that 2 years of preschool isn't important and doesn't have an effect on child outcome, but it's just the magnitude of the effect is less in the second year. But I think some more recent work by Greg Duncan and his colleagues actually shows a quite interesting take on what that could possibly mean, especially in terms of dosage. Their work in looking at Head Start children at age 3, and then those Head Start children moving in the 4-year age to public preschool had better outcomes than those who attended Head Start for 2 years. So interesting. So it's dosage combined with perhaps different content and perhaps different quality. I'm not sure, Greg, you can speak to that later. But again, it's not just how many years or perhaps what you're getting during those years that could affect outcomes in terms of child outcomes in preschool. So interesting in terms of threshold duration. Again, another issue regarding dosage is the intended, offered, and received. And I think the data clearly shows that there is often greater intended dosage than is received. It basically means you can offer a program, but not everyone always shows up. And so this is an interesting variable because it's not necessarily always looked at and examined in child outcome data in terms of how long children actually participated in the intervention. But usually often they're kind of grouped in terms of the pre and post, but intended dosage is always more than received. And there's 2 studies, one from DC and also one from Chicago, that actually shows some interesting findings. In the DC study, Head Start, more than a fourth of the students enrolled missed than 10% of school days. Again, just interesting in terms of what we know about dosage intended and dosage received, and again, trying to figure out how much you actually need to improve or affect child outcomes. Similar in Chicago, a half of 3-year-olds and a third of 4-year-olds miss more than 10% of school days. Again, just trying to get a sense of what exactly do we mean when we say dosage of preschool, who's getting it, what are they getting, and what are the outcomes. So I would suggest that again, the studies that were reviewed, mostly all of them talked about high quality and that the importance of high quality interventions. And again, I want to just think about what we mean when we say preschool. Does preschool work? And so forgive the analogy. Dosage of what? What are we talking about? Are we talking about dosage of a certain kind of program? Does it have to include certain things in order for it to be considered high quality? And the dosage of what, I think, is also importantly tied to outcomes. Dosage of what to provide what kind of outcome. What are we looking for? What are we seeking to achieve? So forgive this, but calories, it's a similar, my analogy for preschool. Lots of things are 250 calories, right? I mean, you can actually have a huge meal of something and a small meal of something, all equaling 250 calories. But perhaps when you're thinking about what your intention of eating is, that you may consider what kind of calorie intake you take. So the content matters. So a Hershey bar may make you happy, but may not necessarily be a healthy intake, but it's 250 calories. Versus 4.5 cups of kale, which is the same equivalent of calories, maybe fill you up and make you feel healthy, but if you're not necessarily worried about those things, maybe not make you so happy. So again, content really does matter, even though the amount of calories or the amount of preschool may be the same. The quality and the content really should be examined to see if we actually can figure out what is it that we're trying to do, and we also want to be mostly sure of what we're trying to do in terms of outcomes. What are we trying to do for children? Where do we want them to be? So again, the takeaway from that is not to eat more kale, but not all preschool is equal. In terms of dosage, if we give more of what, we may want to ask that question in terms of not just giving more. And I would also, and again, Arthur, forgive me for using the wrong word, fade out instead of drop off, did you say? Until dosage and content are closely examined, we may continue to see the drop-off, effects of preschool. I think if you can't really examine what you're actually looking for and what you're trying to see matters, it's hard to tell what works. So what we did in terms of reviewing the literature, we took 8 of the programs that are commonly used, or commonly cited, as evidence that preschool works. And they're programs, again, designed by many people in this room today. And we tried to look at both the content and the quality of those programs, content and dosage of those programs. So these are the 8 programs. And I also would just like to say that the dosage that you see and the content that you see may not reflect the current program, but what we did is went back and looked at the evaluation and what was done during the evaluation. So that's what some of these, that's what this data is based on. Not, again, somebody could argue very easily perhaps in terms of what's being done in the Perry Preschool Project, and we'll talk about the Tennessee Project in a minute, but these are, again, based on programs, what was done at the time of the evaluation. So very interesting. Perry Preschool, 2.5 hours a day, 5 days a week, 2 years, 8 months per year, and then the model of high scope and home visits. So we know the content and the dosage. And compared to some things today, the dosage may look perhaps a little bit less, but the outcomes, as we know, were very, very strong. The Abecedarian Project, 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, 5 years plus, and I just looked mostly at what was done during the preschool part of that. I hope I got that right. Program curriculum focused on language and cognitive development, and I know that there were specific curricula that went along with that. The Chicago Child Care Center, Arthur's work in terms of originally half a day, then it was expanded to full day, 5 days a week, a full academic year, 6-week summer program, so rather intensive program for 1 to 2 years. And again, a focus on literacy and social emotional emphasis, which to me, when I saw your slide in terms of the reading, to me made some sense. Perhaps you would interpret that differently, though. In terms of the Head Start Impact Study, there was a mix of half-day and full-day programs, primarily academic years and 1 year of Head Start. The majority of the programs use high scope and creative curriculum, but as we start moving down to the Head Start Implementation Study, and people started also looking at implementation science work in terms of this, we know probably a little bit less about how these programs were implemented in terms of fidelity of implementation, and also what programs that were not necessarily using high scope and creative curriculum, what they actually did use. So we get to the Tennessee Voluntary Preschool Program, which the results just came out last week, I think, in terms of the fade out or drop-off. And I was really surprised by this in particular because a minimum of 5.5 hours a day, 180 days a year, which seems quite normal for preschool, the variability, there were 22 programs that the schools could choose, or the preschools could choose in terms of what they could implement. And in the list, it was interesting because not many of them actually, again, from what I know in terms of the research, had evidence base in terms of what their outcomes were. So not to say that I was surprised about the results that came out, but in terms of looking at this in terms of dosage and content, there may be an explanation for that. The same was true in Oklahoma. There was variable. People actually got to select the content, although there was a full and half day in academic year. The Abbott Preschool, again, this 6 hours a day, 180 days a year, with added wraparound services, again, intense, variable, and I say that because most of it, in the reports that Steve Barnett's work has suggested that most of it's been high scope and creative curriculum. There were some sites that used the Curiosity Corner out of Success for All, but they were limited. And then finally, we get to the Boston Preschool that folks have probably been reading about most recently. And I say that they use OWLS 2007 because I have been reminded by folks on that project that that was different than the OWLS that's currently being implemented actually in preschool classrooms, as well as building blocks, Doug Clements and Julie's work. So here's a view of what we know in terms of dosage and content. And the interesting part of this is that, again, we want to talk a little bit about what this means. And it would be helpful, actually, to be able to, when we just talk about programs, to also think about how much and how much of what in terms of what we know works in preschool. So, again, I'd like us to think about, when we think about dosage, to not think of it necessarily by itself, but think about content plus the quality of a program, including the dosage, and then also considering what that means in terms of outcomes, child outcomes. And child outcomes, I think, can mean many things, but I would hope that we would take a look at the research that we know in terms of what we know is having significant effects on young children. And I think that here we also are, may come up to some things that there's a gap in our, not necessarily our knowledge about what works, but perhaps a gap in our knowledge about what works and how we implement that actually in classrooms. So just briefly, if we look at what matters, and again, this is not my work. This is work that's been done by others. David Dickinson's work and Fernald's work, based a lot on what Hart and Risley did. It seems that from the research that a large predictor of what child outcomes matter has to do with language and vocabulary early on. What kids learn in the early years will affect how they can perform later on. And it's not just in terms of literacy. The work has been done in terms of reading. I know that David Dickinson's work and Anne Fernald's work is focused on the literacy aspect, but Susan Levine and Kelly Mix have also looked at the issue regarding math, that children's strong language and vocabulary skills predict their ability to do math, and which makes sense because math requires reading and understanding things conceptually, as well as social emotional development. There's been some work by the author Spear and also mentioning that not only does language and literacy, language in particular vocabulary development, help children be able to work better with peers and be able to talk about what their needs are and express their needs and wishes. So language and vocabulary does have a basis in the early years, and then also can affect those key content areas, which also talks about overall success. I know this is a very narrow view of what success means and outcomes, but in terms of some of the work that's been done in terms of preschool curricula, we have been looking at content areas, and I'll talk to you about the PIECERS project in just a second. But again, what do we mean by language and vocabulary? Again, a strong emphasis on developing foundational skills that in fact could, in some ways, prepare children not only for being able to express themselves and get the things that they need, but also it has a large relationship to reading skills. So when I see the drop-off in first grade, when typically, although these days kindergarten really is the entry for beginning reading, when you see drop-off in first grade, perhaps it could be related to not only the fact that preschool did a great job, but perhaps didn't do a great job in preparing kids to do the things that they may potentially need to be successful in these content areas or just in general, and being able to express themselves and use language to appropriately get what they need and learn what they need to do. So the content. So if we can diverge a bit, I want to talk about dosage and content for preschool curricula, and I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the PIECERS evaluation project with the randomized control trials of these evaluations. And I do know from conversations with folks that have been involved in this and were a part of both the evaluation piece and also part of the implementation, that this was not that there were problems and this is not the perfect evaluation. So I understand that. But I think the findings are interesting, especially in terms of us that are interested in looking at content and dosage and quality. So this is just regarding the programs that focused on literacy outcomes when they evaluated 14 programs, of which OWLS was one of them, Creative Curriculum was one of them, I don't think High Scope was one of them. I can't remember all of them on the list. DLM, Express was one of them, which was the one that actually came out as being the one that showed effects. And this is, again, not a criticism of the program. This is just one evaluation that showed these findings, that 1 out of the 14 programs actually showed an effect on child outcome vocabulary and language, which, again, to me, as I interpret this, is there is a gap in being able to actually figure out what we need to put in classrooms, what the content is, to be able to actually have the outcome that we'd like in terms of not only quality, but content and also dosage. We also know from some of the work that Susan Newman and her colleagues have done is that she reviewed several commonly used preschool programs and tried to see what level of instruction on language and vocabulary development these programs afforded the teachers, and basically found that there were great limitations in that. Again, suggesting that curricula perhaps maybe needs to be examined in terms of content and also in terms of outcome. Like what do we expect to see, not only what, but how much of what we want to see. How much language and literacy do you need to have? How much book reading do you need to have? What is the dosage of things that you need to have in order to be able to get an effect? Their colleague, Dwyer, looked at specific classrooms and found that less than 15 minutes a day was spent on vocabulary development. Again, trying to drill down and see what the content is so that we can try to figure out what amount of how much needs to be put into classrooms. And I'm not suggesting by any stretch that this is something that is a scripted program that teachers need to follow, step 1, step 2, but it more requires maybe organizing the way that that training is done in terms of how teachers interact with young children and the goals of trying to create language and literacy opportunities during the day. So the question, I think it's probably the million-dollar question, is does preschool work? One of the reasons we're probably all here today is, we've thought about this, does it work? Does it matter? How much of it matters? And I would say, given the work that we've done in terms of trying to survey what we know about preschool, that what do you mean by preschool? What is in that black box? The program and the content really does matter. I think it's something that has not necessarily been looked at specifically in terms of amount, dosage, and intensity of what is happening in preschool classrooms to help us figure out what about preschool works, or if it works, and what more we need to put into it to make it work better. And I also think that these two issues regarding quality and fidelity have not really been adequately addressed in our examination of preschool programs. We talk a lot about what may work, and then folks go out and do what we think works, but there's not a lot of follow-up in terms of how fidelity and quality are then examined in terms of giving folks feedback, but also what standards may exist in terms of judging fidelity and also judging quality. So I don't have an answer to preschool work. I do think preschool does work. I do think high-quality preschool works. I think that my definition of high quality may be different than some people's definition of high quality, but I think that if we look at the research that suggests what predicts kids' outcomes, I think that's what we should look at in terms of trying to define and figure out the content, the amount, and the quality of what's in a preschool classroom. But I will also say from work that we have done that there's challenges with developing language and literacy and vocabulary with young children. And so it requires teachers in many ways to change the way they interact with children. I'll share with you a little information that we have been working on with regard to reviewing vocabulary interventions for preschool teachers and looking at the research on book reading. And I just found this fascinating, and I'll share it with you, that, we all think that kids learn vocabulary through repeated exposures. I mean, that seems like regarding what background knowledge they may have, but repeated exposures, except for, I understand the fast mapping when the kid learns that dinosaur name that nobody knows, they learn it on the first time. But typically, it requires a lot of repeated exposures in the context in which are meaningful for the children. So in reviewing some of the programs, I'll talk to you about one. Children had the opportunity to have 50 sessions of a book reading. That's kind of a lot, 50. And they were exposed to 108 target words that the teacher actually talked about, defined, extended beyond the book reading experience to the children. And interestingly enough, they gave an assessment, which was not a standardized assessment, but an assessment of those words that the children were exposed to. So they randomly selected out of 108 words, 22 words that the children were exposed to, and showed them pictures of what those words were and asked them if they can identify them. And the children were able, in the intervention group, were able to identify 4 words out of the 22 words correctly. And I personally was surprised by that, because when you think 108 words, 50 sessions, 22 words of randomly selected, 4 words. So what I would say to that is that we need to think about the content, the quality, the dosage, how we're implementing things to be able to figure out the outcomes, and then with that, help our teachers figure out how to do that in classrooms. It's on us as researchers, as people that are interested in how children change in classrooms and as teachers, because I'm used to talking to teachers. The training is really important. It needs to be incorporated in any conversation that we have about this. And finally, the fidelity of implementation. I do know that the Boston project did have a very high fidelity of implementation check, but I will also say that this is really something that's become new in terms of implementation science. So it's not to say that the other programs couldn't or wouldn't have, just that was not part of what folks were looking at the time. We were asked to actually give some recommendations for policy and for researchers, so I will tell you what I think these should be. I'll go back to that. Obviously, research dosage and content together. Don't talk about them as being 2 separate things. They're really, I don't know how you could possibly talk about quantity of something without quantity of what, and try to figure out what you mean when you talk about content. And also communicate to practitioners and policymakers your research findings. I think Early Childhood Research Quarterly did a little survey in terms of how much actually the studies that were put in that actually went into practitioner journals, and it was sadly not a lot. I think it's on us to be able to try to communicate to people that actually are responsible for implementing these things, that they get to know what we're talking about, especially from the research field. And then include parents and teachers in discussions about research questions and findings. And I really say this because probably one of the smartest people that in this field, Barbara Bowman, who I don't think she's here, said in a conversation panel at the Shankar Institute a couple years ago, she said very poignantly, people and kids' families, kids in poverty, their families talk to one another. It's not that people do not talk and not use language. She said that it is the case that perhaps that language does not necessarily map onto the expectations of schools. So I think I included this because I think it's on us to try to figure out not only what research questions that we think are important, but what research questions or what challenges are faced by families and also teachers in terms of implementing the findings that we may actually come about learning. The final thing in terms of policy recommendations, again, consider the content and dosage of preschool and policy decisions. To say we're going to implement preschool or universal preschool or any preschool, I would hope that we would think carefully about what kind of preschool and what we're going to be spending that important dollars on. Also, again, given the research findings, that I would say that we would also support preschool interventions that include evidence of increases in children's child language and vocabulary outcomes, since we know the basis for that really does impact long-term learning. And then finally, I think that there is real evidence to suggest that populations, that vulnerable populations should get priority access to preschool, given that mostly the programs that we did review were geared towards high poverty, vulnerable populations.